Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Grand Rounds. We have a set of speakers this morning. Dr. Don Graham, who's an adjunct clinical professor, Department of Medicine, Southern Illinois, School of Medicine, and also an active practitioner at Springfield Clinic, is going to be our initial speaker, followed by Mr. Roger Billings, a professor in the Salmon P. Chase College of Law, Northern Kentucky University. Learned a few things about Dr. Graham I'll share with you. He's a native of Springfield. He's a Golden Domer, having graduated from Notre Dame. Did his residency at WashU in St. Louis and a fellowship in infectious diseases at the Jewish Hospital of St. Louis. He was also an epidemic intelligence service officer in the hospital infections branch of the Centers for Disease Control in the late 80s, and he joined the Springfield Clinic in 1980, founding the Department of Infectious Diseases, which he headed till 2015. He has published book chapters, presentations, and all 175, 180 of them. He was a trustee of the Illinois State Medical Society for 8 years and served as the president of the Sangamon County Medical Society between 1996 and 2017. We all see Dr. Graham on a regular basis in Grand Rounds asking insightful probing questions, and he's been a great addition to us here. So welcome, Dr. Graham, and we look forward to hearing about medicine in the time of Lincoln. By the way, Lincoln would be 212 years old today.
Thank you, Dr. Flack. It's a pleasure to be here. One thing I've always learned is it's unwise to correct your seniors, but in this case I must. Today actually is the 210th birthday of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, were Southern Illinois University in existence at that time, would have been the congressman representing the territory that SIU serves. However, such was not the case. In fact, when Lincoln was a congressman and president, there were no medical schools here, there were no hospitals. And that's what's very important to our discussion today. Lincoln was born in Hodgenville, Kentucky. This is a rendition of his house. You might call it a house. I want to disclose my conflicts of interest. I am a stockholder in Union Pacific. It was created after Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act on July 1, 1862. I also have been a member of the board of directors of St. John's Hospital, which provided home care to Mary Lincoln. Now, the university requires other conflicts of interest, so I must tell you I work for some health departments, I've been on speakers bureaus, and I have done research supported by industry, none of which existed at the time of Lincoln. Today, we hope that the participants will be able to define life-threatening infections since the 18th century, many of which continue now. We want you to recognize the need for infrastructure in public health, and we will describe the evolution of the standard of care. First, let's set the medical stage. One of the most famous physicians in history, certainly in the American history, was Benjamin Rush. Born in 1745, he graduated from Princeton at the age of 15, became a physician at the age of 23, by which time he had already translated Hippocrates from Greek to English. He signed the Declaration of Independence, the only physician to do so. He wrote the first chemistry text in the United States. He advocated mercury and bloodletting as his primary modes of therapy. One of his patients was George Washington. You all know him. He had a strep throat, treated unsuccessfully with bloodletting. The most famous physician in the presidential arena was none, but one almost was, and that was William Henry Harrison, who attended Penn Medical School. He left to become a soldier. He died of pneumonia only 31 days after he delivered his 100-minute inaugural, on a day much like this, except for the fact that it's not raining right now. Then we come to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was not a physician. In fact, he had very little education, less than 1 year of formal education. He faced many diseases, politicians, typhoid, malaria, TB, cholera, and smallpox. We always like in these grand rounds exercise to have a case discussion, one that will sort of focus our attention on the matter at hand. Well, I picked a certain patient who was ill with a very important illness, and let's describe his case. This patient was a 54-year-old white married man with fever, headache, extremity weakness, and a rash for 3 days when he presented to his physician. Now, he had received requests to speak at a famous event on November 2nd. He accepted that request. He took a train to rural Pennsylvania. From there, he took a carriage, and further took a horse to speak. However, he noted to his secretary that he felt weak. On November 19, he, not the featured speaker, listened to the featured speaker for 2 hours. He then spoke for 2 minutes. Observers described him as having a ghastly color, looking mournful and haggard. That evening, he was warm with a fever. He was short of breath. He had a headache at 6:30 p.m., and his personal servant applied a wet towel to his face, which was one of the major therapeutic options available then. He took a train back home. The next day, he didn't feel well. He was exhausted with back pain, and on November 21st, he had a diffuse rash. He canceled his appointments and went to bed. He consumed dry toast and strong tea as his therapy. His past medical history was not particularly revealing. He'd had no operations. The only medications were an occasional mustard plaster and some pills called blue mass, which were composed of mercury for energy and depression and fatigue. He was allergic to nothing documented, and he'd had no immunizations. Family history was taken. His father had died at age 73, probably of renal failure. His mother had died at age 34 of milk sickness from the white snake root toxin. A picture of that white snake root is here for you. A brother had died in infancy. A sister had died at age 21 in childbirth. A son had died at age 4 of uncertain causes. Most thought typhoid, some thought TB. Various physicians consulted, but no one could confirm the diagnosis. A son died at age 11 in February of the same year of typhoid. Another son had a cleft palate, as some thought 100 years later. He was 10 years old, and he was recovering from a 3-week episode of fever, weakness, and a scarlet eruption. This could be important. He died 8 years later of tuberculosis. And his last son was 20. He was alive and well. He died 62 years later of a stroke. One of his boys was a man named Tad Lincoln, a boy named Tad Lincoln. You can see in his, right in the middle of his upper lip, could be a cleft, as some thought many years later. Our patient had a social history, as does every patient. He had been delivered at home by vaginal delivery in rural Kentucky. His estimated weight, because there were no scales, was 7 pounds. His mother had had no prenatal care, which meant that he had no prenatal care. But he never smoked, he never drank. He had 6 months of formal education. He had no military service. He had no foreign travel, except insofar as he visited New Orleans. His occupation was that of a farm laborer, a deckhand, a merchant's assistant, an inventor. He had 1 patent. He was an attorney, a politician, an axe handler, and most important, a raconteur. His wife was afebrile. She had a history of depression, but was otherwise not ill. The 20-year-old son was healthy in college when last seen in September. On exam, this was a well-developed, well-nourished, thin, bearded white man in no acute distress. His weight was estimated to be 160. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall. Temperature was 102 with a pulse of 110. Blood pressure was estimated at 90/50. He had red conjunctivae. He had mild icterus. And he was noted to be far-sighted. which has many meanings. His neck was supple without adenopathy. His thyroid was not enlarged. His chest had a few dry crackles. His cardiac exam was normal. His abdomen was normal, except he was thin. Some thought that they could feel his liver. His extremities were normal. He had no effusion or loose joints. The most objective observation was that he had size 14 shoes. He was alert and oriented. He was witty, insightful, had excellent judgment. His fund of knowledge far exceeded the level of education. His cranial nerves were intact. He was noted to have a loping gait. But he also had a diffuse scarlet macular rash. Diagnostic tests are generally undertaken when patients have puzzling illnesses. In this case, no laboratory tests were available. An EKG, chest x-ray, CT, MRI, pulmonary function tests, all part of the standard workup in 2019. The echocardiogram, the cardiac cath, the adult PHQ-2 and 9, the bone density were either unavailable or felt to be unnecessary by his physician. But the physician did come up with an impression. He said, I am dealing with a middle-aged man who has a fever, a diffuse scarlet rash, and prostration. The differential is wide, very wide, and I will tell you a 2019 differential: rickettsial pox, disseminated herpes simplex, meningococcemia, varicella, adenovirus, smallpox, chickenpox, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, typhoid, hepatitis, endocarditis, and a drug reaction. Did he have any of these things? Well, his doctor had a plan. All doctors should have a plan when they're evaluating a patient. This plan was clinical observation, a poultice, a bland diet, and rest. His doctor did not order any laboratory tests, x-rays, or other form of imaging. This is our patient in a picture taken a few years before. He appears to be well-dressed, slightly disheveled, but certainly a handsome lad. Now the follow-up. Every case has a follow-up. We don't just stop with the presentation. Well, on November 21, the patient was described as having a scarlet rash. His physician, a Robert King Stone, M.D., concluded that he had a cold. It was an excellent diagnosis, Dr. King, Dr. Stone. Some questioned that diagnosis, so he altered it to say he had bilious fever. That could be. Some questioned it further. He altered it further to say he had scarlatina. This could be the diagnosis, but others were doubtful. After all, we're dealing with a very important patient. What do you do when you have a very important patient with a diagnosis in doubt? You request consultation, which indeed he did. Indeed he did. He called the world-famous, or at least nationally famous, Washington Chew Van Bibber, M.D., from the distant town of Baltimore. Dr. Van Bibber arrived at the time the patient developed a diffuse, small, widely scattered set of blisters. Dr. Van Bibber consulted and said, I think you have a touch of the varioloid. The patient said, before he heard this, he said, well, doctor, what is your verdict? Which is an interesting question from a patient who is an attorney to his doctor. That's when Dr. Van Bibber said, I think you have a touch of the varioloid. The patient responded, how interesting. Even unpleasant situations in life may have certain compensations. Did you pass through the waiting room? Van Bibber said, I passed through a room full of people. Yes, it's always full. Do you have any idea what they're there for? Says the doctor, I could guess. And the patient responds, they're there, every mother's son of them, for one purpose only, namely, to get something from me. For once in my life, I find myself in a position to give everybody something. Then followed the hospital course, because when you have an illness this severe, generally you're admitted to the hospital. In this case, the hospital course is as described in green on that slide. Over the next 2 months, the fever abated. The patient's face became marked, as described by a reporter from the Chicago Tribune, one of the most astute diagnosticians in the entire case. On December 7th, the patient walked briefly, although he was noted to be emaciated. Nevertheless, on December 8th, he wrote and submitted to Congress the proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction as he's recovering from smallpox. The next day, he submitted the State of the Union, which was then called the Message to Congress. He finally had time for some recreation, and he attended Shakespeare's Henry IV at Ford's Theater on December 15th. By January 12, he was said to be returning to his stamina. Unfortunately, there was a sad note. His personal servant, William H. Johnson, died at the age 30 of smallpox. Mr. Johnson had been the man that had applied the cold towel to Lincoln's face on November 19th. The follow-up was not scheduled, although periodically he would see Dr. Stone at his home, which was a large clapboard house painted white, not known then as the White House. But what he had was smallpox. Smallpox has several forms. The ordinary form, which is quite severe, as you can see here with the diffuse, very extensive rash, involves all the organs, with at least a 30% mortality. And there's a modified form, which is not quite so severe, called varioloid, which is less likely to be fatal, usually just a few percentage. And the latter was what our president was thought to have had. Smallpox is a DNA orthopox virus. It's contagious from the time of the rash until the scabs form. So for many days, many weeks, he could have been contagious. The spread is from person to person for a distance of 6 feet. It starts with pustules develop on the throat, the face, the palms, and soles, and spreads to the trunk, in contrast to chickenpox, which goes the opposite way. It has stages. First day, you just see flat spots on the face. The next day, you see slightly raised spots, papules. On days 4 and 5, you see little blisters called vesicles. At the end of the week, pustules form, and from the 2nd to the 4th week, scabs and crusts form, which lead to a permanent pockmarking. Smallpox was a scourge from antiquity till the middle of the 20th century. 6 defined epidemics occurred in the United States during the 20th century. 410 people died in 1901 in New York. They had the distinction of having the last epidemic in our country, when 12 cases were found, including 2 deaths. The book you can see is called House on Fire by William Fagey. He and a man named Don Hopkins were the leaders of the CDC and the World Health Organization attempt to eradicate smallpox in India and in East Africa in the 70s. Dr. Fagey wrote this book to commemorate it. His co-worker, Dr. Don Hopkins, wrote a famous monograph about smallpox in which he described the case of Abraham Lincoln. Now, smallpox wasn't the only problem we had. We had malaria, too. And a very interesting doctor's thesis was written by a doctor named Lorenzo Dal Matheny in 1836. Quite a long time ago, but quite perceptive. At that time, Mr. Matheny was a student at Transylvania University School of Medicine in Lexington, Kentucky. Not every physician went to school, but he did. The prevailing theory at that time was that rhubarb, calomel, and aloes pills would cure every disease. It was espoused primarily by a Professor Cook. All the students believed that, at least they thought they did, but in practice it didn't always work. Mr. Matheny understood that it didn't always work. Well, chance favors the prepared mind, and in 1835, there was an epidemic of malaria, which was reported in 1836. Matheny said that Illinois was so flat that the spring rains would stand until winter. He said that Sangamon was the largest and finest county with 1,500 inhabitants and could not possibly be excelled in any county in the country. True, isn't it? The spring and the summer of 1835 were the hottest known on record. It rained every single day from March 1 through July 15. That's a lot of rain. Illness began to be noted on August 10. There were 12 physicians in Springfield at the time. Now consider the number of physicians we have. We've maintained a similar ratio, but everyone in town was ill by August 20. All 12 physicians were engaged day and night, according to the thesis. Deaths were occurred despite having 6 times the usual dose of Cook's pills. Matheny was asked to consult on September 25 on a 35-year-old man who had fever and chills. He decided, in a rather heretical move, to prescribe quinine and laudanum, 5 milliliters, 1 teaspoon every hour. The patient experienced a drenching sweat. 2 days later, he had a cold sweat. Unsure of his diagnosis, Matheny added sulfonic ether and salt injections with a dash of whiskey and a red pepper rub. Surely that would do it. Well, on September 30, he had brandy, more quinine, camphor, and carbonate of ammonia. He noted that the pulse revived 2 hours later. Now, this is a physician who is maintaining a very careful observation of his patient. For 2 hours, he sat at the bedside with his patient and monitored his pulse, and then the pulse revived. I challenge all of our physicians to sit at the bedside for 2 consecutive hours with any of your patients. Matheny added opium, brandy, and more castor oil. He described the patient as being much better the next day. He concluded that the best way to treat this disease was a combination of quinine, 65 milligrams, camphor, opium, and ammonium carbonate every hour times 3. And he said further that his conclusions were drawn not in the study room, such as at the unstated Transylvania University, but from actual observation in the field, a model for all of us. Other diseases existed in Springfield and Sangamon County, and indeed throughout the Midwest then. We had scarlet fever, diphtheria, measles, mumps, whooping cough, lung fever, a very fancy name for pneumonia, brain fever, an even better name for meningitis. I actually like brain fever better. Cholera, syphilis, snakebite, St. Anthony's fire, which is caused by ergot from contaminated rye, and mercury poisoning, often caused by the physicians who prescribed the mercury, and malaria. Cholera was a major threat in these days. The first case was described in Springfield in 1832. The same year, 3,000 people died in Chicago and 4,000 people died in New Orleans. The next year, Jacksonville had an epidemic. Cholera returned here in Sangamon County 4 times over the next decade. But with all these problems, we needed some public health response. Springfield's first doctor arrived in 1820, a man named Gershom Jane. In 1832, John Todd was appointed to the Springfield Board of Health. If that name sounds familiar, it should. He was the uncle of Mary Todd. 5 years later, he co-founded the medical faculty, which was the precursor to the Sangamon County Medical Society. By 1850, we had 4,500 residents here. We had probably as many hogs. They were roaming the public square. The streets were muddied. The Illinois State Medical Society began in 1850 and advocated registration of births, deaths, and marriages. It also opposed patent medications and proprietary medications. In 1855, our county slaughtered 30,000 hogs, which is 1 hog for every 6 people in the county. 3 years later, coal was discovered in Riverton, and it's clear that Sangamon County was on its way to prosperity with coal and hogs everywhere. Camp Butler opened in 1861 when the Civil War began. It was for Illinois recruits. It became a prisoner of war camp the next year. The first female physician arrived in 1869, Amelia Hastings. A very important development occurred in 1870 when we opened a reservoir with 4 million gallons of fresh, pure water. This might help us combat salmonella and typhoid, other typhoid illness, and cholera. It was on Reservoir Street, in case you wanted to find out where the reservoir was. St. John's Hospital opened in 1875. Not of much help to our president. It did help his wife. The University of Illinois started in 1882, its medical school. Memorial Hospital opened as Memorial Hospital and Training Center, I believe, in 1897. Smallpox, which afflicted our president, was then the subject of concern in 1898 during the Spanish-American War, and every one of the troops was required to be immunized. The Sangamon County Medical Society began in 1899, Springfield Clinic in 1939, and SIU School of Medicine, where we stand, was started in 1970 with its first class graduating in 73.
Charlene.
Well over 100 years after Lincoln died. Well, our country started with a fairly good life expectancy. In 1790, those born in 1790 could expect to live 44 years. And notice that men and women lived about the same time. However, in the next century, our life expectancy actually worsened. By the middle of the century, those born in 1850, men could expect to live 36.8 years and women 37 years. Now, one contributor to the drop in lifespan was the Civil War. 8% of white men aged 14 to 33 in 1860 died in the Civil War. An incredible loss of life. It reversed in the later part of the century, 49.5 and 51. You see now the separation. Men and women have a different life expectancy, and it's only widened. Now, a child born in 2018 would expect to live 76 years for a boy and 81 years for a girl, unless we do something about it. I like to look at what role illness played in presidential politics. Lincoln was one of 4 candidates in 1860. He was the Republican, number 3 Democrats or quasi-Democrats who were running against him. John Breckinridge of Kentucky, John Bell of Tennessee, and Stephen A. Douglas of our own state of Illinois. Lincoln's vice president was Hannibal Hamlin. Now, had Lincoln died in 1863 of smallpox, and he had a 30% chance of dying, he would have been succeeded by Mr. Hamlin, who at one time had been a senator from Maine. Would he have carried on the policies of Lincoln? Possibly. However, suppose Lincoln had not won the election and Stephen A. Douglas had won, and at one time he was the favorite. Stephen A. Douglas died 3 months after the inauguration of Lincoln. And of course, it would have been his own inauguration. Douglas had typhoid. Douglas's vice presidential candidate was a man with a distinguished name and a rather murky background, Herschel Vespasian Johnson. Johnson was the governor of Georgia. Thought to be a progressive man, he favored the Union, but he had some other habits, such as owning many slaves, favoring the states' rights. Had he been elected vice president, he would have taken over as the president 3 months after the inauguration. Very fateful time in our country. In June of 1861, to have the former governor of Georgia, a slave owner, as our president. It makes you shudder. Breckinridge and Bell would have served their entire presidency had they been elected. Now, one cartoon is always helpful because I don't want you all just to laugh, or I want you to laugh on it, but there was a big game. Baseball was played then, and you can see Lincoln was the winner, Breckinridge, Douglas, and Bell just left holding the bat. Breckinridge, by the way, recently was in the news because his statue in Lexington at the county courthouse was moved to the cemetery because of his association with the South. He became a Confederate general and left the service of the United States to become a Confederate in 1861. In 1864, there were 2 candidates. Lincoln, as you know, died. He was succeeded by a Southerner, Andrew Johnson. The opponent was George McClellan. His running mate was the son-in-law of Francis Scott Key. Other than that, there's not much to say. But there's other reasons to be concerned about our presidency. Many people have started the presidency. Many people have left. We mentioned Harrison. Zachary Taylor died of gastroenteritis after 16 months as president. Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, all were assassinated. The death of General Taylor is very instructive. You can see him at his deathbed. He's lying there, his wife, and 9 distinguished gentlemen, all physicians, all hopeless and helpless. Couldn't do anything to put Zachary back together, and he died. I suspect the President of the United States now doesn't even have 9 physicians. Other premature terminations included Warren Harding and Franklin Roosevelt because of strokes. John F. Kennedy was assassinated. A premature termination for other reasons was Richard Nixon, who resigned. And one who didn't leave office but probably should have was Woodrow Wilson, who had a stroke with 2 years left in his second term, and he was incapacitated. He, however, was rewarded with his picture on the $100,000 bill. What other occupation has an 18% mortality or a 22% failure to complete service? Now, the Lincoln's health, I mentioned part of it, but Lincoln was shot twice. Another time when he was riding his horse up to the summer home on the north side of Washington. He was also threatened in Baltimore en route to the first inaugural. He therefore took a different route. Abraham and Mary both suffered from depression. Some speculated that Lincoln had Marfan syndrome. And one of the reasons was, in a photograph of Lincoln seated, his right foot is blurred. Why would it blur? Every part of his body was stationary. Well, it might have blurred because he had aortic insufficiency, or a water hammer pulse, which would cause a prominent bounding of the foot. This led to the idea that perhaps he had Marfan syndrome. Other physicians in the 20th century speculated that perhaps he had multiple endocrine neoplasia and thought perhaps his mother had it. The evidence is very thin, but there was enough agitation that an august group of physicians was gathered in 1991, led by Victor McCusick, who was a famous geneticist from Johns Hopkins. They reviewed all the evidence that they could with the thought that they would exhume the body. But they finally concluded that any evidence that they would derive would be ambiguous, and therefore decided to leave Lincoln alone. Before our patient recovered from the smallpox, he recovered to end slavery. He won re-election, and he proposed reconstruction of a land with limitless possibilities. Things looked good when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant on April 9, 1865. But unfortunately, 5 days later, John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in the occiput, and he died from a brain injury the next day. We have several take-home points from this retrospecto stereoscope. Stereoscope is the first slide. Abraham Lincoln and 6 of his 8 first-degree relatives died of preventable causes. Preventable causes. 75% of Lincoln's family died of preventable causes. Second, public health matters. Third, choose your vice president wisely. Our subject, the last photograph taken before he died. Several weeks later, a massive funeral was undertaken, with the train traveling from Washington to Springfield, and on May 3, 1865, reenacted in 2015, his hearse was shown. The riderless horse. I thank you. We will have questions after our second presentation, which will be delivered by Roger Billings, professor at the Salmon P. Chase School of Law at the University of North Kentucky in Covington. Professor Billings has been a long member of the board of directors of the Abraham Lincoln Association and has an avid interest in the medical and legal aspects of Lincoln's career. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Roger Billings.
Well, now, can you hear me? That was the big question yesterday. I stand before you as a medical experiment. I had laryngitis, and I was really interested to see what happened overnight. Well, I guess you can hear me, can't you? I'm glad. Well, Abraham Lincoln, and I'm switching gears on you a little bit now. I'm turning to the legal side of Lincoln's medical history. And Lincoln actually had 3 medical malpractice cases. One of them is Fleming versus Rogers and Crothers. Most Lincoln scholars know this case. It's called the chicken bone case. And that's because Lincoln used chicken bones as demonstrative evidence in his case. I'm pleased to be able to tell you that Lincoln represented the doctors in all 3 of his cases, medical malpractice. So I'm going to just describe one of them, and that's the famous one. The Fleming versus Rogers and Crothers case. One of the first malpractice cases in Illinois, the very first one, I'm told, in Bloomington. Lincoln's contacts with the medical profession are somewhat illustrated in this case, and I will mention a few of them later. The first malpractice case in the United States at the appellate level took place way back in 1794. Cross versus Guthrie. A surgeon named Cross removed one of Mrs. Guthrie's breasts. She died 3 hours later, and her husband sued for 1,000 pounds. Doesn't sound like much, but a pound in those days, I think, was worth a great deal of money. The money was supposed to cover costs and expenses and deprivation of service and company of the wife. Now, the husband won this case against the physician, but his recovery was only 40 pounds. The jury decided that he should have a little loss of companionship, but no more, as if money can actually supplant loss of companionship. I find the case remarkable. How could such a surgery take place without an understanding of sepsis and the use of anesthetics? Up to the Civil War and for 20 years after, there were few invasive surgical procedures. Opening the abdomen was rare, but doctors, that's what they called physicians in Lincoln's day, doctors did perform operations to amputate after compound fractures. Attempts to set a broken bone were the exception, but the introduction of chloroform in 1847 and ether in 1846 reduced the complications of setting bones, improved bandaging, splinting, and packing techniques, helped to prevent sepsis, well before Joseph Lister's concept of antisepsis was introduced in 1867. So that was the state of medicine at the time of the celebrated case of Fleming versus Rogers and Crothers in 1858. The case began back in 1855. The facts are this. A fire in the livery stable behind the Morgan House in Bloomington caused almost the entire number of buildings in 2 square blocks to burn to the ground. And Samuel Fleming had both thighs broken when the Morgan House chimney fell on his legs. Dr. Thomas Rogers and Samuel Fleming, Doctors Thomas Rogers and another, Dr. Crothers, took care of Samuel Fleming by examining him, and they were not optimistic. His left thigh was broken straight across the femur, a square fracture. The right thigh had an oblique fracture, almost a compound fracture. In spite of this, the doctors carefully reset the fractures and affixed splints. Both legs were bandaged with unbleached muslin roller bandage from foot to upper thigh. And more things were done, but I'll spare you the description. Let it suffice. The doctors used up-to-date procedures for that day. After about a month, Fleming's right leg measured 3/4 of an inch shorter than the left. The doctors proposed to break up the adhesions and reset the bone. Fleming said, okay. So they gave Fleming chloroform, and Dr. Crothers manipulated the leg to break up the adhesions, while Dr. Rogers tugged on the foot to produce the proper amount of extension. Suddenly, Fleming began to holler, "For God's sake, hold on." Apparently the chloroform was wearing off. Dr. Crothers let go, and that was before the leg adhesions had broken up. Fleming said he'd rather have a crooked leg than endure any more pain. And it took 5 more months for both legs to heal. But the right leg was misshapen, shorter, and crooked, McLean County Circuit Court. It was a big deal. Altogether, 3 law firms, consisting of 6 lawyers, represented Fleming, the plaintiff. The defendant doctors hired 2 law firms also, consisting of 4 lawyers. These 2 law firms for the defense got their heads together and decided they needed more power. So they hired 2 of the most famous lawyers in Illinois to join the team, John T. Stewart and Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln would be the lead lawyer to defend the doctors. But the plaintiff Fleming also had a lead lawyer that was a good friend of Lincoln's and well known as one of the greatest trial lawyers in Illinois, Leonard Swett. You could say that Lincoln was You could say Lincoln was victorious in this case because he forced a settlement of the case 2 years after it began. In the meantime, there were 4 continuances, 1 hung jury, and a change of venue. Delay helps the defendant. Even today, postponement of a trial is common. Judges are okay with it because they want the parties to have time to settle. Lincoln's postponements in the Fleming case were supported by good reasons. For example, to obtain 1 continuance, Dr. Crothers signed an affidavit that he could not safely proceed to trial because of the absence of Isaac Small. He was a material witness. He had been present at the operation. Crothers remembered that Small was a witness to the resetting of the right leg, and he now lived in Tennessee. He had to have time to locate Small, bring him up to testify. So a postponement. There were more. But the trial eventually took place in McLean County, and after the jury could not decide the case, venue was transferred to Logan County Circuit Court for retrial. A retrial that never happened. Recall that I said the trial was a big deal. Leonard Swett's team for the plaintiff presented testimony from 15 doctors and 21 other witnesses. Lincoln called as his witnesses every one of the remaining doctors in Bloomington, 13 doctors. One of Lincoln's problems was that some jurors were prejudiced against doctors. They thought certain doctors' bills in those days were exorbitant. They resented it. As a side comment, I found several cases where Lincoln had doctors as his client to sue for their fees. And so it seems Lincoln was fighting an uphill battle in the case. That makes his hung jury more remarkable. Unfortunately, we don't have records of the trial that would give us the details that I would love to share with you today, because numerous fires in McLean County Courthouse have reduced the number of documents we have. One snippet about the case appeared as a recollection in the New York Times. Lincoln was examining the plaintiff Fleming on cross-examination. Lincoln, can you walk at all? Fleming, yes, but my leg is short, so I have a limp. Lincoln, well, what I would advise you to do is get down on your knees and thank your Heavenly Father and also these 2 doctors that you have any legs to stand on at all. Spoiler alert, this might be apocryphal. But it might not be apocryphal because similar words were echoed in Lincoln's closing statements, which we have better record of. That summation to the jury, by the way, probably won Lincoln the hung jury. Lincoln concluded that the normal procedure with severe leg injuries in his day was amputation. And Fleming was lucky the doctors saved the leg. He also spoke about the difference in pliability between the young and the old bone. He said the bones from an old chicken, he used the bones from an old chicken to demonstrate the brittle condition of bones from an older human. Of course, he must have snapped the bone in front of the jury. Somebody told me just this morning that somebody kept the bone, and it's found in a museum at Lincoln Memorial University. You can bet I'm going to check on that. Well, it was a brilliant tactic of Lincoln's. Such a demonstrative thing could very well be done today and make the same point. Well, the hung jury was nearly as good as a verdict for Lincoln. After 2 years, the case was settled. Respecting medical issues in general and Abraham Lincoln, I found a line of cases Lincoln had for clients that had purchased real estate. And Lincoln had to go to court to ask for his client's purchase of the real estate to be canceled, which is seldom done. But Lincoln could prove that the snake root was growing wildly on the land, and the land would be relatively worthless for human habitation or for cattle. Because the snake, and it must have been poignant for Lincoln talking about that because he must have recalled very well the snake root through the milk his mother drank, took his mother's life. Now, just for a few minutes we have remaining, I'd like to mention a little bit about the medicines that Lincoln knew. And Dr. Don Graham has been kind enough to start the ball rolling on that. We heard about several of them. And I'm only going to touch a few of them. I think they're interesting. And our records of medicines that the Lincoln family had in their medicine chest comes from Diller's drugstore, where we were fortunately able to keep, to this day, some of their record books. In 1852, Lincoln purchased calomel. The most important thing in calomel is mercury. Lincoln took these blue masses, or blue pills, as was mentioned by Don, for his chronic constipation.
Welcome to Unified Conferencing.
Late in the 1850s, at some point, Lincoln mentioned to a friend he gave up taking blue mass because it made him cross. Thank goodness he stopped taking blue mass because it shows that he was recognizing mercury poisoning in a small amount. And he bought pennyroyal from Diller's drugstore. The pennyroyal is an herb from which an oil is made and in large doses can induce abortion. And it can also kill the mother and cause irreversible kidney and liver damage. Lincoln scholars have wondered if pennyroyal was intended for Mary. And there's carminative. I don't know if I pronounce it right. Carminative. It was an agent such as peppermint taken into a meal to relieve flatulence. Surabicac showed up on the list. In those days, it was for children's cough and chest cold. Brown's mixture, a dual-action formula supposed to help treat diarrhea and stomach upset, which also provides relief from coughs. Castor oil, and we must not forget that the Lincolns used castor oil as shown in the 1859 drugstore records. And then glycerin. It was new at the time, glycerin, and was used as a sweet lubricant for sore throat. I wish I had some now. The Lincolns fell prey to patent medicine, like everybody else in that day. The record shows they bought a box of Wright's pills. That was probably Wright's Indian vegetable pills. It was widely used in the Civil War as a laxative. Another patent medicine Lincoln actually mentioned in the jury trial was Sappington's pills. These might have been somewhat effective because they contained quinine. They were universally used in America at the time. Finally, in Lincoln's day, another recommended remedy was sour mash, copper distilled bourbon. When taken with sarsaparilla and Columbo root, it was good against the ague fits or ague fits. By the way, bourbon was said to be good against snake bites when taken in time and quantity. The whiskey cure here would not have been for Lincoln. Lincoln was, as advertised, a teetotaler. Now, winding down, I thought I would just mention very briefly a few of the doctors that Lincoln used. William Wallace was his brother-in-law here in Springfield. His brother-in-law, that was the family physician, William Wallace. Anson Henry is a little revered or a little paid attention to doctor who was here in Springfield when Lincoln lost his mind over the probably over the breaking of his engagement with Mary Todd. And Dr. Henry was no psychiatrist, and maybe he was no physician of any kind. I don't know, but he can be given a lot of credit for pulling Lincoln through when he was actually suicidal. And Robert Stone, as mentioned, was the doctor in Washington that Lincoln used. The dentists had their time with Lincoln here in Springfield. We think it was Amos French that took out Lincoln's tooth, and he didn't do too good a job. He took the pieces of the jaw with it. It took Lincoln a week to recover. He couldn't speak or talk or eat, but he recovered. And then a Dr. G.S. Wolfe in 1862 had another try in Lincoln's mouth, and he took out another tooth with forceps. But when he had the forceps on the tooth, a strange thing happened. Lincoln reached in his pocket, whipped out a bottle of chloroform, opened the top, and took 3 deep breaths. And then put the bottle back and said, "You can proceed, doctor." And I'm sure it helped him. There was a Dr. Zachary who was a podiatrist, and he took care of Lincoln's 14-size feet. He had bunions and other problems. Once he treated Lincoln's wrist, too. Lincoln visited military hospitals, and that's another story for another day. But Lincoln would follow the doctor's orders in making rounds of the patients. Once upon a time, he visited 5,000 at once when he was visiting Grant at City Point. And somebody came running in and said, Mr. Lincoln, there's a ward of 500 that you missed, and they're all asking, can you come to see them? And so Lincoln, his arm, dangling, went back and saw them all. Spent hours doing this. And he came back and they said, "Oh, your arm must be in bad shape." And he said, "Oh, no," he picks up the axe, the famous axe, and he whacks on a piece of wood. And then he said, "Look at this." And he lifts the axe up, holding it straight out, which takes enormous, energy, strength. He did that several times, so that was not the first time. But he liked to show off his strength with an axe. And I think he basically was a friend of the physician, when you look at it ultimately. Friend of the doctor. And otherwise it wouldn't be so comfortable to be standing up here in front of you. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you for attending.
This is the day of the annual Abraham Lincoln Association Symposium, which will start at 11 o'clock at the Old State Capitol. So if you want to continue in this vein, feel free to do so. There will be no charge. Several interesting lectures during the day. But right now, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. We also want to, a good question for me, we also would like to invite you all to join the Abraham Lincoln Association, which is a very fine group, started in 1908 in anticipation of the 100th birthday of Lincoln. We have been very great supporters of Lincoln and his heritage and his learning, and would invite you all to join.
We've brought some some freebies for you to take if you're interested in Lincoln. And if you're interested in the little brochure, by the way, it's a 50 big bucks to join. It's not going to bother anybody, but it does take, it is to attract you if you're really interested in Lincoln. And otherwise, just join us whenever you can. Otherwise, well, and so there's a box back there in the corner. That's what I'm trying to point out. So thanks. Thanks for the commercial.
There's a question in the middle row. Mr. Cornelius.
A question for either of you. The chicken bone that Lincoln broke in exemplifying this patient's case has actual similarities to a mature male thigh bone, or was that something of a ruse?
I don't actually know which bone he broke. Some chicken bones are very hard to duplicate in the human body, and perhaps the drumstick might have been what he used. Do you know which bone he used?
I don't know which bone, but I would say, from a legal point of view, it doesn't matter. It was demonstrative. It was a bone, and it made the point, and it didn't matter that it was anything real.
As I once told an otolaryngologist, all bones are the same. As you know, there are 3 bones inside your ear, but orthopedic surgeons don't agree.
I heard this morning from somebody of fairly good repute that they have the bone in Harrogate, Tennessee, at the Lincoln Memorial University Museum.
For those of you who want to study further, there's the list of references is printed on the back table. You can take them and study them further. Even people from Ohio, maybe have a question from Ohio.
What's your thinking on
what Mary Lincoln was suffering from? I mean, I've seen various diagnoses of diabetes, certain other mental conditions, psychological diseases. What's your current thinking on that?
Mary may have suffered from diabetes, but it couldn't have been very severe because there really was no treatment for it. I think she suffered primarily from depression. I think she was not given the due that she deserved. She was a very, very intelligent woman and was kind of eclipsed by the fame of her husband, but she encouraged him greatly. She was, in a way, the incentive for him to move ahead. But her depression and perhaps a little bit of agitated depression, which led to hospitalization. At one time she was in a sanitarium, was nearly fatal for her, but she did recover. I can't give you the exact psychiatric diagnosis for her. One of the presenters at the symposium a couple years ago wrote a book about the health of Mary Lincoln, and I could refer you to that book. I could ask Roger.
Schrader book?
Yes.
Yeah, there's a really great little book called Lincoln in Medicine by, I only remember the last name, Schroeder Lyon. It's 120 pages long, and she was quite careful, and I think she consulted proper medical authority when she didn't know something. And I think you'd love it. It's really absolutely fascinating. But with regard to Mary, just a brief comment. There's a persistent line of talk about her that she had, quote, female problems, unquote. There's something, if you read her letters and so forth, she might have had, I don't know what they were, gynecological problems, whatever, some kind of imbalance of hormones, but there's a persistent kind of a creditable train of discussion. And that's all I know.
Mental state. The insanity file, McNeely.
Yes, there's the insanity file on Lincoln, on Mary.
The Madness of Mary Lincoln, which is much.
Yeah, that's what we can help you with at the ALA. We can put those books in your hands.
Well, we would like to thank you very much. We've only gone 30 times as long as the Gettysburg Address.